Today is an important day. It's a special day. It marks the 50th anniversary of Special Olympics. 50 years ago today, there was a track meet held at Soldier Field in Chicago for people with disabilities. It was the first of its kind with intellectual disabilities. First of its kind. And Special Olympics was born. Now, I talk a lot about individuals with intellectual disabilities because, you know why? They deserve our respect. They deserve our support. And Special Olympics done a great job on both fronts. But it's also a great day because I have a good reason to eat donuts. Tim Hortons across the country, if you're not aware of this, are celebrating the 50th anniversary with special donuts designed by Special Olympics athlete Savannah Lucier from Grand Prairie. Proceeds are going to go to Special Olympics across the country. So I hope you take a moment, drop into Tim's, and order a donut. Or 7. I'll probably do 7. The theme today, though, around the country and around the world is a day of inclusion. And there's been lots of progress over the last 50 years, thanks to athletes with intellectual disabilities. I mentioned our donut designer, Savannah, who has Down syndrome, and it doesn't let it stop her. Lots of progress in the last 50 years. But progress is made thanks to the parents, the brothers, sisters, other family members. It's thanks to literally tens of thousands of volunteers, coaches, staff, and thanks to individuals and companies who donate and support. I'm especially thankful to our Money Talks friends like Neil McIver at McIver Capital, Jim and Nikki Barkasy at the Newton Animal Hospital, Andrew Rulin, Integrated Wealth Management, and of course Mike Levy and Rob Levy, John Murphy at Performing Equity, Paul Dixon at Resource World Magazine, Jeff Olin at Vision Capital, Leanne and Mike Karolinko at Studio City Rentals, and others, and I'll mention them in a bit. But progress has been made, but there is so much more to do, and that's my point right now, and I'm going to give you an example. Today's a day of inclusion. Well, my question is, talking about healthcare, how many times do you think governments consider the impact of policies on people with intellectual disabilities? Now, I want to be clear. This is my opinion, just my personal opinion. I do not speak for Special Olympics. I simply am a volunteer there. So don't hang this on them. But my opinion is that too often the impact of policies on people with intellectual disabilities isn't even considered. Otherwise, why would people with intellectual disabilities not get the same medical care as you and I do? And make no mistake, they do not. I mean, do you understand? I mean, I had to get sensitized to this. I had to learn this. People with intellectual disabilities can't advocate for themselves. They don't go to a medical professional and start saying, I have a problem with my eyes, or my leg, or my teeth. No, that doesn't happen. Worrisome is that the adult population with intellectual disabilities have a shorter lifespan. And I'm willing to bet, here's my point, for all the premiers' meetings on healthcare, the challenge for people with intellectual disabilities may have never been discussed. Because otherwise we wouldn't get this. It should be unacceptable to Canadians that people with intellectual disabilities do not have the same level of medical care as I do, as you do. This is despite, by the way, some good reports recently. I'm happy to see them. Ontario Ombudsman in 2016, as an example. Another by the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences in Toronto. The conclusion was just what I've been alluding to, that people with intellectual disabilities are not well served. The medical profession isn't trained, by and large, to deal with people with intellectual disabilities. I'm going to give you another example on this day of inclusion. When the minimum wage laws were enacted in Ontario, I'd bet my house that the impact on people with intellectual disabilities, well, disabilities in general, was never discussed. Think about this. There were tens of thousands of hours of debate, and I'll bet the impact of the sharp increase in minimum wage on people with intellectual disabilities was never discussed. They weren't in the picture. Same goes for the Alberta government's rise in minimum wage. Same goes for the BC government. I can't think of a time when it was discussed in the media. I can't think of it being mentioned by advocates, groups like Organized Labor, not even on the radar. And that's got to change. In Ontario, the government actually eliminated an exemption for organization providing jobs to the intellectually or physically disabled. I mean, I'm just still shaking my head at that. Matthew Lau reports that according to the Globe and Mail, the immediate impact of that sharp rise in minimum wage, just this year, there's another one coming next year, that most of these organizations stopped hiring people with cognitive disabilities. They stopped hiring, but it was worse than that. Community centers, other nonprofits were forced to let go of their existing disabled workers. I mean, the parents formed a protest. Nothing happened. I mean, I can get into a lot of aspects of this, but my point today is that This is not on purpose. They're not sitting there saying, gee, I hope I can make it tough for people with intellectual disabilities. My point is that people with intellectual disabilities are so marginalized, they don't get considered. And that's where progress can take place. With your help. Let's push for further progress. This should be unacceptable in Canada. It is to me. Let's do more than talk the talk. That's our modus operandi. It's time for action. And I hope we do it. This, the 50th anniversary of Special Olympics. The next 50 years, we should figure out how we want it to do. And also, by the way, I came back and I said, and it starts there because I can't tell you how much this meant to me, that people who listen to Money Talks jumped in and helped. Ron Roddick, Discount Hawaii Car Rental, Kelly Wong and Jerry Au at Spitzer Golf Products, Eamon Piercy Group, Eric Coffin, you know him from HRA Advisors, our own Joseph Schachter Energy Report, Tyler Bullhorn at Stock Scores, Ryan Irvine, Keystone Financial, Ozzie, of course, Victor, Jatinder Ray of Response Advertising, Anthony Beyruti, Venue Kings, Kevin Lemole of Emergent Environmental and Rail Services. All these people did something. I mean, that's the best part. That's how progress is made, is people step up and actually do things. And there's many more. I mean, Chris Metcalf, Stu Rogers, Neil Moody, Mike Cowden, Tim Collins, Mark Dublisky, Scotty Grubb, Paul Beatty, David Morgan, Martin Mirabille, Vanny Bourbon. I mean, it's great. It's a fantastic list. Time now for this week's quote of the week. And I must say, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with this quote because it's so blunt. It features the tug-of-war between principle and politics. On June 8th, you'll recall that popular celebrity chef, TV personality, author Anthony Bourdain committed suicide. Well, 3 months earlier, he was interviewed by populist Maria Bustillos. The interview was published last Sunday, and it caused an uproar due to Bourdain's no-holds-barred honesty, especially when it came to politics. I mean, he was absolutely no fan of Donald Trump. He thought President Obama was a very nice and honest man who disappointed in some areas, but he saved his scathing words, most scathing, for Bill and Hillary Clinton. And he's referring to the myriad of sex scandals. He called the former president, in quotes, a piece of crap. He didn't say crap, he said something else. Who was, in quotes, entitled, rapey, gropey, grabby, disgusting. Referring to both Bill and Hillary Clinton, he said, in quotes, the way they efficiently dismantled, destroyed, and shamelessly discredited these women for speaking their truth is unforgivable, end of quote. But then he went on to take dead aim on what he called the screaming hypocrisy of all those who now suddenly proclaim their support for the hashtag #MeToo movement, but turned a blind eye to the Clintons, to which I say amen. It was just like the Hollywood stars who didn't know about Harvey Weinstein, turned a blind eye. Well, certainly the Democrats and the progressive left ignored the credible claims of rape by Juanita Broderick, Kathleen Wiley, and Paula Jones, as well as ignoring the predatory nature of the former president on numerous other occasions. And what I find incredible, and why this was so pertinent, the Clintons are still getting away with it. 2 years ago, Bill Clinton was the most popular Democrat among Democrats. Today, he's on the speaking tour. Thousands line up to see him. And I bet many have been on the Me Too grandstand earlier in the year. How they rectify those two things is absolutely beyond me. As Mr. Bourdain observed, screaming hypocrisy that does a major disservice to people sincerely, not politically, sincerely concerned about sexual harassment and assault against women. I've never been able to figure that one out. How we got a pass. Can you imagine if Harvey Weinstein went on a speaking tour right now? Well, you better tell me what the difference is in this case. Very pleased to welcome back to the show John Johnston, Executive VP, Chief Strategist, Davis Ray. John, first of all, I appreciate finding time in the summer for us, but there's a ton to talk about.
Yeah, there is, and it's a pleasure to be here, by the way.
Well, I started the show talking about the new threat of auto tariffs, but of course we're in a trade sort of war environment right now, thanks to the president. And, it's just interesting or difficult, I think, also for investors to make sense of that. Should we be running for the hills or should we wait for an escalation? Can you put a little perspective on it for us?
Well, I'll do my best. This is not the kind of thing a lot of us are trained to process. And just as a starting point, and I'll give you some context afterwards, but I spent some time looking back at what happened in the post-World War I period leading up through the Great Depression, and tried to use that as kind of a framework for now. But right now, I'm inclined to think I'm very nervous about this whole trade thing, and I'm really concerned that we're unwinding the global order that has dominated my life and has generated so much wealth and opportunity in the world. And I'm worried that that's going into reverse. So I'm quite concerned about what's happening on the tariff front, what Trump is doing on a number of fronts, and I'm trying to build that into my forecasts. Right now, my assessment is that the whole trade side is basically throwing sand into the gears of the global economy, which means that it's not going to cause it to stop at the present time, but it's certainly going to slow it down. And the one thing I've been working with a long-term. One of the things I like to do is look at what I think returns are going to be over a 10-year period for equities. And one of the key things in that, and the most important thing in that, is what earnings growth is likely to be. And I tie my long-term earnings growth number to global nominal GDP. So I've got 2 to 3% real growth, 2 to 3% inflation. That gives 4 to 6% nominal GDP, which gives probably 5 to 6% earnings and dividend growth on a global basket of stocks, including emerging markets. Because of the whole trade thing, the way it's evolving, I'm keeping the 4 to 6 number, but I'm shifting the composition to maybe a half a point more of inflation and a half a point less of growth, reflecting the sand in the gears. And this whole globalization has worked to keep inflation lower than many expected. And I think if we unwind it, and I think we are going to unwind it to a degree, it's going to be a reverse supply shock, and it's going to add a bit to inflation. So that's what I've done so far. If we follow through on some of Mr. Trump's more extreme statements and some of the retaliatory threats coming out of the European Union and China, we then have to decide, is that changing the sand to gravel? And if we go from sand to gravel, it's going to have a more material impact on that longer run growth outlook and on the shorter term cyclical outlook. And if it gets really bad, that gravel becomes very rock-like, and it could cause a recession, or it could make a recession worse. Certainly when we look back at the history of tariffs, everybody says Smoot-Hawley caused the Great Depression. The Smoot-Hawley tariff came in the middle of 1930, when the world was already sliding towards a depression because of a global financial crisis. So it made it worse. And the Smoot-Hawley tariff came on the tail end of more than a decade of very high tariffs and rising tariffs across the globe in the aftermath of the First World War. It was so bad, in fact, that they had a number of global conferences, what we would now call G20 summits, to try to get tariffs down, and it didn't work. So we had a decade of rising tariffs before they really had an impact. And they had an impact on an economy that was being driven more by what was happening on the financial side. So they made the Great Depression worse. They didn't cause it. So I'm of the mind now that I'm not inclined to look for trade to cause a recession. There is a recession out there. I'm not exactly sure where it is, when it is. I don't think it's in the next 12 months. I'm more worried about rising U.S. interest rates. The U.S. Fed, for the time being, is still the most important central bank in the world. There's so many corporations globally, particularly in the emerging markets, that have borrowed in U.S. dollars. The rising dollar and rising U.S. rates are tightening global monetary conditions. And, the Fed always tightens until something goes bang. It's not always a recession. It can be a soft landing, but usually for investors it feels like a bang because you get a bear market. And I think that's what's out there. And, you get the mix of rising U.S. interest rates, the mix of trade restrictions, and then you add some uncertainty in the Middle East and oil prices that are going up, not high enough on their own to cause a problem, but you mix them all together, and there's some issues off on the horizon there. So that's my take right now. And one of the things I have to confess is that I'm finding that when I look at the behavior of the global U.S. and Canadian economies and surveys of businesses and consumers, they show a lot less angst about trade than I'm feeling. I look at surveys of economists or economic experts and financial experts, and they're all they've gotten much more pessimistic. But the surveys of the people who are actually on the field making monetary decisions, spending decisions, are a lot more upbeat than us in the chattering classes, and I put myself firmly in the chattering classes. So I think that that's something I've been pleasantly surprised by. So I'm feeling pretty good about the next 12 months. But, if something blows up, we have to reassess. But right now, the trajectory we're on looks decent for the next 12 months for economic growth, earnings growth, and not bad for equities.
We're going to take a break in a moment, so maybe we have to shelve some of this. But, the interest rate environment is interesting, obviously, with the U.S. raising rates, saying very clear signals they're going to do some more. We have the Bank of Canada raising, and that's the one that really impacts Canadians. I mean, whether we're talking about we've got $600 billion in some sort of consumer debt or $1.85 trillion in mortgage debt, with a good chunk of it having to be renewed, coming up in the next short while. I'm just interested in how the Bank of Canada moved and what you see going forward on the interest rate front.
Well, I think the bank is generally acting appropriately, given the context I've given about trade and growth and stuff. So, and we want to get interest rates back to a level that's not at those very low emergency settings where market forces were prevented from working. I think we're now moving up to, we're probably now at a level where market forces are working and capital is being reallocated on a more efficient basis. I don't think it would hurt for the bank to raise rates a bit more as long as the economic and the risk environment didn't change. I certainly think that the Bank of Canada is not going to move nearly as quickly as the Fed is, and I'm kind of thinking that by the end of 2019, the overnight rate, which is 1.5% in Canada now, and that's the key rate for setting, that guides the prime lending rate from banks. I can't see it being above 2%. Maybe it gets to 2%. That would imply 2 more rate hikes. Where in the U.S., the Fed seems determined to get up towards 3% a year out. And just to add to your comments about the debt load, which I think is important, is that the Bank of Canada in its last few financial system reviews has been highlighting the role of home equity lines of credit, which have grown very materially, and those are the part of the lending composition for households where that reacts immediately to these Bank of Canada rate changes. And we all know that in a world of much higher debt loads, everybody's behavior is going to be a lot more sensitive to interest rates than in the past. So the idea of thinking about, the Bank of Canada thinks that a normal setting or a neutral setting for the overnight rate is 2.5% to 3.5%. I think that it's the level that's going to hurt us is below that because of the debt load, the debt in the system.
I'm talking with John Johnson. He's Executive VP, but he's Chief Strategist for Davis Ray. We'll talk a little more strategy. Just talking about interest rates there, that's a big one that with that much debt load, that high a debt load for most Canadians, that obviously has an impact. But the other one is the Canadian dollar. John Johnson, speaking of being a big fan, I'm a big fan of John Johnson's too. He's the Chief Strategist for Davis Ray. John, before the break, you gave us a little bit about, Canadian rates may bump up another 0.5 point, Americans moving faster. What are the implications for the Canadian dollar?
Well, as always, I learned the framework that the Bank of Canada uses to look at the Canadian dollar. And the key longer-term driver of the Canadian dollar is the basket of commodity prices, energy and non-energy. And I think that the economic environment I'm talking about for the next 12 months should be supportive for commodity prices. I know we're getting a bit of a correction in copper here. It's one of the few signs about these trade fears. But I think that the commodity price environment's pretty decent on net for the next 12 months. I think the monetary policy environment, which is the second factor of shorter-term movements, and shorter-term obviously is measured in months, not the market focus on very short term. But I think that these two factors together suggest a flat environment for the Canadian dollar. And I've had to downgrade my views a bit here, as my concerns about the trade environment, which I think are a negative factor for the Canadian dollar, has deteriorated. And I think that it's really not a risk factor anymore. It's a fact, and it's getting worse. And it seems like Mr. Trump is going to play the trade card ahead of the midterm elections because his base seems to really like it. So I think things are probably going to get worse before they get better. And so net, I take the offsetting commodity prices and Bank of Canada policy vis-a-vis the U.S. that's neutral. So flat Canadian dollar with a bit of a negative bias here over the next 12 months from the trade side. So, I'm kind of thinking maybe we get down to the 73-cent mark. We could trade, I think there's a range, but I think the trend within the range of, say, 72 to 78 cents is towards the 73-cent mark over the next 12 months.
My impression is that Canadians still don't understand how significant that is in terms of we just took a pay cut vis-a-vis the U.S. I hope we can compete with them when we're getting a 30% discount on our labor. And of course, anytime we travel into the States and, we import from the States, but that's why that's such a key number. Let me just, we've got a couple minutes left, so I want to broad base this a little bit. And obviously we're just talking generalities, but as the chief strategist, I'm just hearing here that, you're probably not jumping into the bond market,
No.
and you're not too uncomfortable with the equity markets.
Yeah, I'm not bullish per se, but when I look at where the equity markets are now, once again, there's two factors here. What's going to happen to earnings? And I think earnings are going to continue to grow, so that's a positive factor for equity prices. The price earnings multiple, how much people are willing to pay for each dollar of those earnings, has come down a fair amount. This year because of the softness in equity markets on net since early January. I think it's already building in a decent amount of bad news. And, we're not having a major, the last time we saw a big decline in equities was in 2015 into early part of 2016 when we were in the midst of a real significant global slowdown and an earnings recession. Right now, we still have good, strong earnings growth. The global economy looks okay. So I think for the next 12 months, earnings are good. Certainly suggests to me that as we go into 2019, I don't know that there's a lot of downside for the PE multiple. So I think maybe we could get some gains here in equities on a 6 to 9 month view. And so generally upward, not a roaring bull market, but upward, I think, after the correction we had earlier this year. On a 2 to 3 year view, I think we're late in the cycle. I think that the risk-reward is not incredibly favorable at this point in time, and I think that there is a bear market out there, but I don't see it in the next 6 to 9 months, just as I don't see an economic downturn in the next 12 months. Beyond that, it gets more questionable.
You've got about 1 minute. Is there any groups you want to avoid, or ones you like especially?
Well, I'm kind of the view that Canada is going to get hit the hardest by any trade problems, so I'm kind of inclined to be outside of Canada, probably more so in the U.S. than anywhere else for the time being, despite the fact that it's more richly valued. I like cash, and I like short-term bonds, so like kind of anything 2 years and less. These rate hikes have made that a more attractive area, so kind of short-dated U.S. stuff out to 2 years. Including a lot of investment-grade stuff, which you can get 2% plus on that now. I like energy for the time being, and Canadian energy can do quite well. It's pretty cheap. The U.S. banks are very cheap. I think we're in a re-leveraging environment, but I think we just have to get over the flattening yield curve and wait for the Fed to send a signal that it's finished raising rates before we'll start to see that area perform well. But other than that, I like technology, but there's some government issues here, like what's going on in Europe. So I'm just being very careful. So energy in Canada and the banks in the U.S.
Time now for this week's shocking stat. Well, this is a number so big, and it follows on from what Mike Levy was talking about earlier. So big it'll make your head spin. It's actually not comprehensible, which is one of the dangers here. I'm talking about the growth in global debt. So are you ready? Here's the number. See if you could even write it down. Global debt is now $247 trillion. That's the latest number coming out of the Institute of International Finance. By the way, that's up $30 trillion in just 2 years. That's a monster jump. Of the total, to break it down, non-financial corporate debt, $74 trillion, up big time in the last 5 years. Government debt, $67 trillion. Household debt, $47 trillion. Financial debt, $61 trillion. I mean, it's huge. The government debt to GDP ratio in the States, by the way, is now 101%, while non-financial corporate debt is now at record highs in our country, in Canada, also in France and Switzerland. Of course, the big question is, in this period of rising rates, as we just chatted with John Johnston about it, is what are the implications? And I might add, record low interest rates around the world have brought on that borrowing. but it's incredible. Global debt is now 318% of the world's annual economic output. But what's the impact of rising rates, especially when governments have to roll over that debt? That's always been the risk, and it may be coming home to roost. I mean, there's always consequences. Debt adds to deflationary pressure. It always acts like a drag on future economic growth. Why? Because more money's going to interest payments. You don't have as much to spend. I mean, it can threaten the economic and social stability of nations. I suspect it will. You know, the theme of our show since 2014 is Welcome to the Age of Consequences. And this level of debt has consequences. And our goal is to prepare you for them. As I say, an incredible environment as that record amount of debt, $247 trillion, meets a rising interest rate environment. There will be repercussions. Hey, by the way, I was mentioning earlier, 50th anniversary for Special Olympics. Go to a Tim Hortons today, and you will get a donut designed by one of our athletes, Savannah, out of Grand Prairie. And all the proceeds go to Special Olympics. If I've ever needed an excuse to buy a few donuts, a few dozen maybe, this is it. I am definitely on the donut train today at Tim Hortons to do that. I also mentioned this earlier. One of the things that kills me in our country is the sort of anti-corporate rhetoric. Well, I can tell you, we're talking Special Olympics right now, but without the support of major companies, the kind of programs that are all free from Special Olympics, whether it's for speech, whether it's for a healthy athlete, and some of the medical screenings that are necessary because our own healthcare system doesn't do an adequate job with that, whether it's just the fun and the connection and the striving for personal goals from our athletes and our coaches and the parents, it doesn't happen without major corporate support. I know people are companies like Goldcorp, companies like Wheaton Precious Minerals, Canaccord Genuity. I mean, it's incredible the number of companies that step up. In the Vancouver area, I've just got to mention the Do It Group. Pam Keith, her husband Maury, her son Greg, all of them incredible. Daughter Courtney, who's a coach, incredible impact on many charities, but so much focus on Special Olympics in British Columbia. And I have to salute them. But that's what makes things go. That's the best of our country, not the culture of complaint. It's the cohesion that produces things in a variety of charities. But in this case, the 50th anniversary starts today of Special Olympics. Ozzie Jerk joins me on the line right now. Ozzie, I was just thinking, this kind of weather, you know, British Columbia, especially out in the West Coast where you are, has been experiencing this gorgeous weather the last few weeks. And you know what I always find? It gets people talking about, hey, I want to buy one of these vacation properties on one of the islands. I heard a couple of people chat about it recently on the ferries out there. And I thought, you know what? We better give a little do's and don't list for those kind of people before they take the plunge. So what about it? You know, I'm thinking about buying a place on an island. What should I be thinking about?
Yeah, no question about it, Mike. I'm right now in Secret Cove Marina, a great marina, by the way, and people are leaving from all areas to head for the island. And the husband and wife are laying on the beach, and all of a sudden she says, hey, this is so great. Why don't we go buy something? At that point, I advise people to get a sharp stick and poke yourself in the eye, because quite often that's less painful than buying that property, because people don't sit down and say, how will I use the property? Is it for retirement? Is it kids? Is it a weekend retreat? And they don't ask, how long did it take me to get here? For instance, if you're sitting on Texada Island and ask yourself that question, well, there's 3 ferries to get there. It's a full travel day. So if I say, well, I want a weekend retreat, well, really, you know, how far are you? How much time do you want to spend traveling? Or if there is a ferry, how often does it go? Is it a car ferry, or is it like Keats, or is it sort of passengers only? So you have to ask yourself some questions that go beyond just a normal property that you would be buying.
Well, you know, the other one I found, because as you say, a lot of people think about a property and they think, oh, it'd be lovely to spend months there when I'm retired. But this is just an anecdotal experience, but I found that they didn't check out whether, you know, a lot of times as you get older, and we know this from every fact and stat we get, people need health care more often. Something might come up. They need doctors. And I've known a lot of people who've actually bought a property, were forced to sell as their needs for health care increased. I mean, they didn't have proximity. They couldn't take that ferry back. Same for any vacation property. And that's another kind of criteria that people have got to be aware of.
Yeah, and it's more important, like you say, because you're on an island and you have to realize that I mean, quite often, sometimes buy a property and saying, "Oh, I have my own boat, I can go there." But if I'm not healthy or if I had a heart attack, right, you have to ask yourself the questions. Now, quite a few islands, of course, fit all the criteria. For instance, you take Bowen Island, you have a ferry almost every single hour. It's part of the West Vancouver municipality. It has health services, it has schools, and so on. So that island would be perfect for somebody that wants to have access to all the facilities. And other islands, of course, are beautiful too, but so often people buy a vacant lot. Is there septic tank approval? Is there well water? And sometimes people say, yeah, there's well water, but is there enough to beyond brushing my teeth, right, if that's all there is in terms of the well? So you have to see, buy a property on the ocean. You have a 100-foot setback before you can build. You want to build a dock? Well, you likely can't. And so ask the questions. Get a quality realtor that understands not just the particular property, but the regulations and the rules. My goodness, we have Island Trust out there that is sort of a quasi-government police force that will make you do things that you don't want to do, or don't let you do things that you want to do.
I don't want to get myself started on this, Ozzie, but here's another one that you should check out what costs are. I mean, this is what, filed under governments can do anything, and you just reminded me of it. I can't believe that people in some of those islands have a tax bill from the municipality, the closest municipality, but they get no services. A friend of mine pays $2,200 a year on an island that doesn't even have a road, let alone any other service. Zero services. I find it just outrageous, but that's something else to check out.
Oh, no question, and particularly when you dig into some of the islands, I don't want to knock anybody, but the Island Trust has sort of been created when there was a nilly-willy development. Today, there are sort of 3 representatives on an island. 2 are local and 1 is foreign. And if they have been in the bonnet, there's absolutely nothing that can be done. I mean, some islands fight for weekly rentals, some islands fight for amenities increase. And it's just no. And so really be understanding that this is not a normal purchase. You've got to understand a little bit more and do more digging.
Well, there you go. Very quickly, do you have a hot property for us?
Yeah, Kimberley, 3-bedroom house plus a detached 1-bedroom suite, 2 baths, about 2,400 square feet in total. It's an older house, close to downtown, $227,000, a bargain.
And who doesn't say there's affordable housing? Ozzie Jerk, you go out, enjoy the people at Secret Cove, enjoy your boating, and just a major thanks, as I always do to you, for not golfing this weekend. Have a great weekend.
I've been fishing.
Let's go live to the trading desk. Victor Adair is here. Hey, Vic, let me get right to it. What did you do this week?
Mike, this week I was back on the short side of the Canadian dollar, and I had the good fortune, honestly, more by good luck than good management, to take my short position off. In other words, to take some profits before Trump came out with his comments about he didn't like the dollar rising. So, and that's the reason I did that, actually. The Canadian dollar, I thought, wasn't falling as much as it should compared to other currencies, so I had a reason to take profits on that. But anyway, that's what I did, and I ended the week flat. Listen, I was just very impressed, as I always had been, with John Johnson that they had on earlier. If there's a couple of things that he said that really rang true for me, it was his opening remarks. He said, in effect, a lot of us are not trained to process what's going on. And boy, do I ever get that. I mean, it really feels confusing out there to me, like we're in, new territory and we're feeling around like on the Braille system here. The other thing that he said that really rang a bell for me is that it appears that the public at large is less concerned or is more sanguine about these developing trade wars and the spin-off effects from that than he is. And boy, am I ever in his camp. I think things are starting to get, very complicated and perhaps could become very dangerous. And it shows up certainly more in the currency market, but the stock market just goes along like, what me worry. So I'm a little concerned about that.
Well, although you can look at the gold market, it has been worrying. I mean, you look at that peak that you talked to us about back in April. You said, I think the U.S. dollar, drop, it's been rallying since that time you talked to us about, and I watched gold go in the opposite direction.
Yeah, Mike, we talked last week or the week before about how politics has kind of replaced central banks as the most important driver of the world markets, and believe me, I see Trump as the epicenter of politics, and he's done something this week that is really takes it to a different level, and that's not only, escalating his threats about, say, 25% tariffs on autos, tariffs on $500 billion worth of Chinese goods. He has linked the trade wars to the currency wars, and by saying that the EU and China are deliberately devaluing their currencies to get a competitive advantage over America. We're starting to get into dangerous ground here, and like I'm with John, I don't think people, it seems, realize just how risky this could become.
Well, especially, the kind of meddling it's very unusual to have meddle with the Federal Reserve and talking about their policies at the same time. I mean, it's right back to what you just said to us, and you've been saying it for a few weeks, which I love, which is, that Trump has replaced central banks, for about 9 years. All we watch is central bank action. Just like everything else, he seems to have taken precedent over that.
Well, yeah, and I've talked about the Fed. I call it the new Fed under Powell. This is not the same Fed we had under Greenspan, Bernanke, and Yellen. I think this is a different Fed. He did his congressional testimony this week, and, to make it really simple, he said the American economy is doing fine, and we will continue to gradually raise short-term interest rates. I don't think I do him an injustice by saying it that way. I think that was a message. Yep. And on that, the U.S. dollar continued to strengthen, and the U.S. dollar index hit a one-year high before Trump came out and said he's not happy with the Fed, and he didn't like the U.S. dollar going up either. So, it's a tougher market to trade when he's out there, I'll tell you.
Well, we'll be here to chronicle it, Vic. In the meantime, you go out and have a terrific weekend.
Thank you, Mike. You too.
Time now for this week's Goofy Award. 600 cities around the world have ride-sharing. And in the process, many have reported fewer drunk driving arrests, fewer alcohol-related accidents, less congestion, which means lower CO2 emissions. Great way for some people to earn extra income, much-needed extra income. Calgary, Edmonton, Toronto, Montreal all have ride-sharing. Regina and Winnipeg just jumped on board, but not self-described progressive Vancouver, Victoria, the rest of BC. How anyone can call that progressive with a straight face is astounding, especially given the roadblocks so-called progressive governments have put up to prevent consumers in BC from saving money with ride-sharing. Instead of embracing one of the most progressive changes in society, which is the advent of the sharing economy, the self-described progressives in Vision Vancouver and self-described progressives in the BC Liberal and now the NDP government drag their feet, putting up roadblock after roadblock to preserve the status quo that's been in place for over 100 years. This week, the BC NDP went back on their promise to allow ride-sharing in 2017, which was then moved to 2018 and has now been moved to 2019. No date on this one, really. But that's not my goofy. Although the foot dragging is ridiculous, it's the context. The NDP, like the Liberals before them, are putting their own electoral interests ahead of the public's interest because they don't want to offend the taxi drivers, many of which come from a couple of key ridings in Surrey area. No, my goofy goes to the insulting spin on this week's decision to delay it yet again. Delay what 600 cities around the world managed to do. I have no idea why politicians want to insult us so constantly with that spin. I ain't that stupid. I hope you're not either. I mean, we get the electoral politics, but why do they have to insult our intelligence? This week, in announcing the decision to delay ride-sharing, BC Transportation Minister Claire Trevana declared that the decision is not political at all. Give me a break. But she outdid herself moments later, declaring that I wouldn't say the province and the government are far behind the times at all. Really? Not far behind the times? We're only behind 600 other jurisdictions out in BC. We'll wait another year longer while the BC NDP figure out a way to rig the ride-sharing game in favor of the taxi industries. That's what this is about. That's what they're doing. And as I've said before, they are lucky that the vast majority of people in BC have never used Uber or Lyft, because if they had, they'd be furious. Ride sharing has thrived because people love it. They love the convenience. They love how timely it is, that you sit there with your little app and you can see when the car's coming, how long it's going to take. And of course, you got better pricing. All of that, they're working hard to prevent us. But please, don't insult our intelligence on this. And as I say, I don't know why governments do it. That's all the time we have for Money Talks. Please go to moneytalks.net. Lots of great stuff on it. I hope you're listening to the Daily Business Comment. Download it every day. Just go to moneytalks.net. In the meantime, go out and have a terrific weekend. Get a donut at Tim Hortons. Celebrate Special Olympics.